Hi, everyone. Welcome to our MyCares webinar. There have been many headlines recently about microplastics being in our bodies, and today we're going to talk about what that really means with Dr. John Meeker from the University of Michigan School of Public Health. Dr. Meeker is a researcher focused on the consequences of human exposure to environmental and occupational contaminants, as well as identifying and evaluating strategies to control harmful exposures. So he'll start with about a 15-minute presentation, followed by 30 minutes of questions and answers. If you submitted a question ahead of time, I have that, and we'll ask Dr. Meeker those questions, but please also put them in new questions into the Q&A. So Dr. Meeker, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to us about microplastics.
Thank you, Dr. Pierce, for inviting me. I'm happy to be here, and happy Thursday to all of you. For those of you, at least here in the Ann Arbor area, just another beautiful day. So thankful for that. Just give me a second here while I share my screen, and hopefully it will work smoothly as it did in practice. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, it's perfect.
All right, great. So the way this is formatted, I don't have a lot of time to talk, so I'm trying to give an overview of a topic, as Dr. Pierce mentioned, many of you have probably heard about on the news, but is actually quite complex. So I'm going to try to cover some of the main points, and then we can get into some discussion after I complete this short slide deck. So I'll just jump right in. So plastics have been one of the biggest inventions in the past 100 years or so, because it does make our lives a lot more convenient and actually a lot safer in a lot of ways. If you think about making airplanes and automobiles lighter, all the safety things we can have, keeping food fresh for longer. There are many benefits to plastics and the ways we can make them and use them in our lives, and in a lot of different ways. So here is showing just a graphic that you've probably seen before with your waste management company or something, or somewhere along the line, talking about the different types of plastics and how they group them as it relates to recycling. And so these are pretty much the main plastics that are produced, but there are many others, and those relative ratios might change over time based on what things are used for and where the demand is and what sorts of new technologies come about. So you see number one is polyethylene tetrathalate, to high density polyethylene, HDPE. We have PVC, polyvinyl chloride, LDPE, low density polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, and then a whole host of others, all lumped into number 7. And it gives some examples. And if you're not familiar with how plastics are made or things like that, they are quite a diverse group of polymers that can be manufactured to have certain desirable qualities. And that's why there's so many different kinds and different. You can see some of the uses there listed in the blue text, just a wide range of things. So you need different properties of those plastics to achieve the different uses that are desired. And we'll come back to this at the end. But with that, like I said, hugely diverse array of things that plastics are used for. They can come in many different levels of hardness, rigidness, toughness, colors, flexibility, things like that. But with that comes a lot of plastic waste, of course. And so you might have seen some of these images at the bottom where they're finding plastics everywhere in the oceans, everywhere on land, as well as in wildlife. Down in the lower right is an albatross bird. They've been recently sort of notorious for picking up these plastic fragments thinking it's food, and then ultimately leads to their demise because they cannot process those in their bodies. So plastics, like I said, a lot of benefits, but we also need to think about what are the potential downsides as well. So that brings us to the topic of today, which is microplastics, an emerging topic of concern, again, that you've probably heard about. And I'm going to talk about it in this backdrop of plastic production and a diverse range of types of plastics and how they're made and what properties they possess. So here's just an example of a picture showing some plastic fragments made from different actual types of plastic. So what are microplastics? They're broadly defined as plastics that are found in sizes, a diameter across of less than 5 millimeters. So I put a penny here so you can see the penny is about 19 millimeters across. So just a fraction of that penny about to the Lincoln Memorial there from the edge is about 5 millimeters. So anything that size or smaller is broadly defined as a microplastic, but that includes anything less than that. So we're talking about orders of magnitude range in sizes, which really does impact the way they behave in the environment, as well as how someone might be exposed. And then further down the line, how they might act in the body and potentially be toxic. So again, we have a wide range of sizes, a wide range of actual materials in the way they're manufactured and used. And then we have a subset that might also be of concern in the very, very tiny range. From about 100 micrometers or less, some define this as 10 micrometers or less. Then we're talking about nanoplastics. And those, of course, might behave differently just because of the extremely small size, like we see with, say, air pollution and fine particulate matter. So as a matter of terminology, a lot of times we'll refer to these as just MNPs, micro and nanoplastics, to try to encompass the broad range, and knowing that there are some major differences in how they behave between something that might be larger in the micro range versus something much smaller in the nano range. So these have been found, and you see studies every day coming out these days that they're found everywhere, even in the most remote parts of the world. They're finding these fragments of plastics. They're of concern for human exposure. We're concerned about house dust, soil, surface water, indoor air tends to have higher levels, and then just your ambient outdoor air. They're finding them in all these locations, and that leads to them being detected in tap water, bottled water, different types of seafood, salt, honey, unfortunately beer. And then because they're found in wastewater a lot of times is used as sewage sludge, which is applied as a fertilizer in many cases. It gets in agricultural lands and then can be incorporated into the foods that are grown, as well as in livestock and then subsequently meat that we eat. So again, this is still a very new science, and still just most studies are just coming out saying we've measured it, and it's hard to really do much else with that at this point. But just again, as an intro to the topic, this is what we're seeing, basically, that they are just about everywhere. Another potential concern that they've seen, and a lot of this work comes from the marine environment, where they're finding them in waterways and in sea life, but they can also preferentially bind to other agents such as pathogens. So harmful bacteria and things like that could sort of gain passage to the body by attaching to these when then we subsequently eat seafood or something like that, as well as other environmental pollutants or chemicals. So persistent organic pollutants, POPs, for example, DDT or PCBs that have been studied for decades and been known to be harmful. They have seen, at least in say water, that these persistent chemicals may also attach to the small pieces of plastic, and then that impacts how they might act throughout the food chain and things like that. So I talked about the diversity in size, wide range of size, diversity in the makeup, the actual chemical makeup of the plastics. And then we also have huge differences in shape. And the shape of the microplastic or nanoplastic is also going to really influence how it behaves in the environment, how it's formed, how it travels, and how it might make its way to people as well. So we have fragments, spheres, fibers, pellets, foam, sheets, and films are some of the main types. So you can maybe visualize how these might act differently in the environment, or once you ingest, for example, one of these, how they might behave differently in the body, the GI tract or something like that. So that's another complicated factor that we're dealing with when we try to study these or make any sort of conclusions about their exposure or toxicity. Then we have, I apologize in advance for the smallness of this next slide, but I think it's illustrative of, again, getting at the complexity of this. So on the left is talking about different sources of micro and nanoplastics and how they might get into the environment. And this is, again, a lot of the work has been done in the marine environment. So this is relating to how they make their way to waterways, but it does show a lot of the primary sources, even sources you might not have thought about, like car tires. They get worn down. There's plastics involved in the making of tires. So that's a huge source. Artificial turfs. Another one that a lot of people don't think about is, you go and you're shopping, you're an informed consumer, you go and you buy that Patagonia fleece that's made of recycled plastics, but every time you wear and then especially wash that, it's going to be giving off some of these plastic fibers, which then can be then end up in the wastewater and further down the line. Another one that's more obvious and sort of one of those regrettable things was, you might recall, they used to advertise a lot about microbeads in consumer products, cosmetics, things like that, for exfoliation, help you clean your teeth better in your toothpaste, things like that. Those were actually manufactured as microplastics and placed into products, which would then obviously make their way into wastewater. A lot of those have been banned in a lot of countries, but they are still in use fairly widely. So this is just, again, just an intro. There's many other sources that I'm not going to touch on right now, but and on the right, also very kind of small and hard to read. Again, just speaking about the wide diversity of plastics and sort of the proportion of what they are when they are measured as microplastics in water, at least. So when we think about how humans are exposed to micro and nanoplastics, we go back to our basics and the fundamentals of human exposure assessment. So on the left is just an example of an exposure. We think about exposure sources, pathways, and routes. So I just talked about sources. And then now we're going to talk about pathways briefly. So on the left is just an example of a chemical disposal site. So you can do this for any sort of exposure scenario and map out where that contaminant, in this case, micro and nanoplastics, where it might go, and then how it might travel throughout those different phases of the environment, and ultimately potentially make their way to a target organism. In most cases, we're concerned about humans and how that happens. So it can travel through these pathways. We call that fate and transport, and get to the outer envelope of the human. And then we have typically 3 or 4 major routes of exposure that we talk about, where it actually gets inside of our bodies. And that's ingestion, inhalation, and skin or dermal absorption. So for nano and microplastics thus far, it looks like mostly we're exposed through those top 2, ingestion and inhalation. But there is still some question about the very tiny ones, whether that skin absorption would be of concern. That hasn't really been studied yet. So for now, we're focusing primarily on ingestion and inhalation. So then we get to toxicity. So again, a lot of the earlier research was done in the marine environment and among marine animals. So a lot of the early work on toxicity involved zooplankton, who mistake these tiny pieces of plastics for food. They consume them, and then it basically incapacitates them. So you have a couple of things that happen there. They die off, and that disrupts the food chain. So there's some a chain effect of that food chain ecologically, where you might have lower populations of a wide range of species because that lower level of the food chain is impacted. And then you also have the possibility of those plastics making their way into larger species that are then consumed by humans. So back to that fish and shellfish, where they measure those, that is, they might be directly getting them from the water, but also from their food and their food's food, and further down the line. When we get to mammals, this has been not well studied at all. The past 3 years or so, I'd say, there's been a ton of effort to start doing this, but we're still in the very early stages. There have been some studies looking at or reporting impacted liver function, altered metabolism, which then of course could have downstream impacts on other health effects and diseases. And then again, thinking about the complexity of some of the aspects of this, both chemically and physically. On the physical side, the size of that plastic will really help determine where it might end up. The larger pieces, if you ingest it, might go straight through and be excreted, whereas the much smaller ones might be able to migrate through cells and things like that, which would be, of course, be of concern if the body then can't attack or process or excrete it from there. And then there's some more recent evidence of things like DNA damage, oxidative stress, and inflammation. Again, those are processes that can lead to a whole host of other adverse health effects. But again, it's still in the early stages. We don't really know the scale of what this might look like or how it compares to other risks that we study out there. So again, I'm sorry, I'm not able to tell you exactly what the risks are, but just know there's a lot of research going on to try to get that. A lot of it is occurring in Europe, but hopefully the US will start to catch up there with regards to funding and things like that. So at the bottom there, ultimately we like to also do, in addition to experimental studies in animals and cell lines, we like to do human studies called epidemiology that are observational. So we would go out and measure someone's exposure and a bunch of individuals in a population and see what patterns we see or associations between those exposure levels and various health outcomes. But we're not quite there yet, hopefully in the near future. This is just from a recent review article. A lot of people trying to synthesize the limited information out there so far from animal studies and cell line studies to get at what might be impacted. So some of the early concerns, again, might be the nervous system, kidneys, the digestive tract, and metabolism. For airborne micro nanoplastics, of course, you have the respiratory system and the lungs. They've actually measured some of these in lung tissue. And then another recent one of concern is placenta. One for my research group that we're interested in thinking about is, because we focus on pregnancy and child development, is are they getting into the placenta, which early studies suggest they are, and then if so, what are the adverse effects of that? So a lot of questions remain. And so there are, like I said, a lot of research groups, maybe not a lot, a few research groups, a growing number of research groups trying to address these. So who is exposed to high levels of micro nanoplastics? What behaviors and activities and zip code, is that an important factor, as it is with many other environmental exposures? People who work in plastics and textiles, the manufacturing of those, things like that. How is the exposure happening? Again, back to that pathways and routes. There's still a lot we don't know there. How do we best measure or estimate exposure? This is one of the limiting factors why we haven't done epidemiology on it yet, is because it's very difficult to know how to measure that. Where do these go after the exposure occurred? How are they absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and excreted? What we call ADME in the body that helps determine how toxic it might be. And then with regards to toxicity, we have the diversity in the size, shape, and things like that, chemical makeup. Which of those properties are the most important to toxicity? It's probably some sort of combination of all those things, depending on the interplay there. And then I mentioned the toxicants or pathogens that might attach to them and then be exposed. And then finally, again, thinking about epidemiology, are we talking about exposure now, exposure back from birth? What are the factors or parameters related to exposure that are most important for specific types of health outcomes? Usually for something like cancer, we're interested in very long-term exposure, but for seeing something like a inflammation response, maybe that only takes a very short term of exposure. So again, some of the details that we need to think about moving forward. We also have to think about back to the plastic manufacturer. So there are thousands of different chemicals that might be used as additives in the making of plastic. And I mentioned that it's to help them get the desired properties for their intended use. So you have plasticizers, flame retardants, heat stabilizers, fillers, impact modifiers, antioxidants, colorants, lubricants, antimicrobials, UV blockers, things like that. There's a huge list, and then within each of these, there might be different types of chemicals. So that top one, for example, plasticizers, a group of chemicals called phthalates are among the most common and most used types of plasticizers, particularly in PVC, polyvinyl chloride. And phthalates have been associated with anti-androgen anti-androgenicity. They reduced steroid levels in humans and a range of other adverse health effects. And it should be noted that the amount of additives varies. So I have here, it's estimated that any given piece of plastic might have around 20 additives, some more, some less. But for something like PVC, sometimes that actual product might be up to 70 or 80% of actual additives of the entire mass of the product. So we've seen, like in the old days, a plastic shower curtain might be 75% phthalate, even though it's PVC. So that's a concern. Flame retardants, things like PVDEs, they're used a lot in electronics. So you have plastics. My computer I'm talking to right now has a lot of plastic, and all that plastic has incorporated into it some flame retardants to help slow its burning if it catches on fire. So again, another thing to think about as we talk about plastics and microplastics. So how do we reduce our exposure, and how do we fix the problem? The reduction of exposure, we still aren't quite clear because we aren't sure exactly what the most important pathways and routes of exposure are. So, there are people who have shown that certain types of balls you put in your clothes, your washer and dryer might help absorb these and prevent them from getting in the waste stream, which is fine and good. But as far as your personal exposure, you talk about indoor air, we have to borrow from what we know about other contaminants. So indoor air would be increased ventilation, filtration, things like that. So that's still in its infancy. So then we have to kind of think broader. Can we recycle plastics better so there's not as much plastic laying around to become exposed to sunlight and become brittle and then break down into tiny pieces? That'd be great. Unfortunately, most people tend to overestimate how much plastic they try to recycle actually gets recycled. And this is a huge problem that hopefully will be addressed in the coming years. And hopefully they can start making plastics that are more recyclable as well. And think about it from cradle to grave, as we call it in the environmental world. When you make a product, think about that entire product life cycle. Now it's going to impact things beyond its intended use. And then finally, plastic production. This is from National Geographic issue from a few years ago that I like just because of the way they've presented this information. But you can see that exponential increase in general plastic production since 1950, just huge increases that continue to grow steeply. And the reason I like this one is because it has the color coding on what the different uses and industries those plastics belong to. And the concerning thing here is, some of these plastics, they have usable lives of years or decades. And, that's one thing. But if you see that pink triangle at the bottom, that's representing the amount of increase in plastics used for packaging, which are typically only used once and then disposed of and maybe recycled. So, and that's a lot of that does end up in the environment and may end up as micro and nanoplastics. So again, just I think we really need to think about plastic usage, plastic production. It is a major component of oil use globally, is for the making of plastics. So it is a broad issue that we need to think about in your daily life, what you're using and buying for plastics. And when you buy it, are you thinking about where that plastic goes after you use it, things like that. So unfortunately, I don't have very concrete, personal things you can do to reduce your exposure levels, but maybe we can discuss that a bit more in a minute here. So that brings us to questions and discussion. And here is just a nice graphic I found in Science Magazine from 2021 that I think kind of summarizes what I just talked about. So thank you all for your attention, and we can open it up. Dr. Pierce.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Meeker. I mean, this is so interesting to think about. It's not just the microplastics, but the chemicals that are additives that are part of the microplastics. And so it's an even bigger issue. As I look at some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time, one question was, is there a way we can check to see how much plastic is in our bodies?
Did I stop sharing my screen? Would that help, you think?
Uh, sure. Yeah, sure. It's
I
great.
don't know. Okay. What was the question?
So is there a way for people to measure how much plastic is in their body? I imagine there's probably no commercial test for that.
Commercially, not that I know of. They're still trying to figure out how to do it, like I said, from a research perspective. So I had a slide there talking about, they have measured it in people's poop, which I put there to be kind of funny, but that's really where it started, where they found out or put it together that people are being exposed as they started measuring it. So now they're looking at where else can we measure. I mentioned placenta. That's a specialized, potentially susceptible life stage and group. But there have also been attempts to measure it in blood, and those are continuing to be developed. But it is challenging if you think about what are you measuring? Are you measuring? Do you have to use microscopy? If it's a specific chemical you're interested in, a lot of times we can do that. But if it's sort of the holistic approach of micro and nanoplastics, there's a lot there to try to capture. That does make it challenging. So at this time, I don't know of something that we can just go out and do to get at this, but maybe in the future.
And what about, is there any way to cleanse the body of microplastics?
Not at this time that I know of. Again, it was, we don't know enough about for the broad range of plastics. Most of the studies I mentioned also use sort of commercially manufactured micro nanoplastics to use in a lab. They're not using sort of that hugely diverse amount of things that we might encounter in our daily lives. So you have that. So we need to understand, again, how it's distributed, metabolized, and excreted. So hopefully if people, if we are able to come up with ways to prevent future exposure, the body would start to clear that out on its own. But I don't know of any methods that would be advisable to try to do that in absence of that sort of information. The best I can come up with is trying to prevent, which again needs to be much more informed from some of this research that needs to be done.
Yeah. So a lot of work to still be done. And I will put in a plug for my cares that this is the kind of thing that down the line we would be able to study. So that's at least forward thinking and opportunities to understand this better. What I know that there aren't data about associations between microplastics and specific diseases, but I'm wondering if you can hypothesize about, let's say, endocrine disorders like polycystic ovarian syndrome, diabetes, inflammatory diseases, obesity, sort of taking from your knowledge of the impact of even some of the chemical additives that are part of the microplastics.
Yes, that's a big question, and sort of the main one that we want to get at in what we do. So again, because it's a hugely diverse type of agent that we're not used to, we can learn from studies that we've done on specific chemicals or air pollution, particulate matter, things like that. The early types of results, people are hypothesizing some of these links that you asked about based on some of that earlier data, and then based on some of the early experimental data with some of these research nano and microplastics. So they have seen increased inflammation and metabolic effects. So then that leads to, it might be plausible that it impacts things like diabetes or obesity, because it's impacting those types of systems and sparking some of these biological responses that might lead to that downstream. So again, it could be the actual particle itself, that plastic, the physical plastic, if it's getting in the wrong place, because it's small enough to be transferred between compartments and into cells. Or it could be some of these additive chemicals. So I mentioned phthalates. Yeah, we do know phthalates impact steroid hormone levels. Phthalates are also associated with increased oxidative stress and some of these other mechanisms. So yeah, again, it's plausible, but we don't know, what those, a whole lot about those links yet, and then how that compares with some of the other things that we're seeing to be associated with those outcomes. So I think it is going to be a focus in the future, and of concern as well.
Yeah, really important research questions to answer. And another question that we have, which comes back to the observations that there may be microplastics in the placenta, are about the impact on infant mortality. And whether that's likely, or more downstream effects in children.
Yeah, this is, of course, another one that's of big concern, given that we are starting to see them in placental tissue, and what we know about some of these additive chemicals. So I mentioned phthalates. There is good evidence that phthalates do have an adverse impact on pregnancy outcomes, including early pregnancy loss, preterm birth, preeclampsia, things like that. So that's a concern. Some of those other additives as well. People have probably heard of bisphenol A, BPA, used in polycarbonate plastics. That also is known to be an endocrine disruptor, involved in some of these same processes and potentially linked to some of these same outcomes. Flame retardants, again, a lot of the flame retardants that might be used in plastics, endocrine active, things like that. So yeah, there's a long list of concerns, and the perinatal period is sensitive anyway, to many things. And so, yeah, we really need to figure out what is something with micro nanoplastics adversely impacting that pregnancy, and then how does it compare with some of the other risk factors. So, when doing this work, I'm always careful to say, we need to also pay attention to the known risk factors as well, when counseling patients and things like that. So we know, smoking, alcohol, drugs, some of those things we know are bad. We need to really continue to pay attention to those things and other psychosocial impacts, and then continue to add to that based on what we find with some of this environmental research.
Yep, super important. All right, so we have a specific question about polyvinyl alcohol, PVA, and its use in products like dishwasher detergent and laundry sheets. So people think that they're being environmentally friendly by using those. Are they? And or is that just sort of a trick that isn't necessarily a good thing?
That's a great question, and I'm not super familiar with PVA specifically, so there's not a whole lot I can say about that without doing some additional reading first. But yes, historically, most plastics are made from oil and petroleum, and there's the extraction. So if we think about life cycle, again, you have extraction of that oil, you have the manufacturing process of the plastic, and you have the use of the plastic, and then the disposal and waste stream. So hopefully, governments, companies, consumers, through education and increased knowledge, will continue to increase thinking this way, when they make decisions, because hopefully with chemical engineering, there are some bioplastics that are coming out that might be made from plants, for example. They're going to have their own strengths and weaknesses or limitations based on some of the things that make plastics great, and that they don't break down is great for some things, but as we've seen, it's really bad for other things. So there is a lot of activity there, but getting those to be adopted and making policies to sort of push the industry in that direction is going to take a lot as well. So I'm hopeful that things like that will increase, as well as, like I mentioned, thinking about that life cycle, even if it is a petroleum-based plastic, know exactly what it's being made for, how it's going to be used, and how it's going to be disposed of, and how that waste stream is going to be managed, and hopefully get that recycle percentage. That slide I showed that most plastics are, less than 30% recycled, probably most of them hovering around, single digits. How do we increase that number? And it's going to require them to really improve the way it's made and manufactured, and just be more thoughtful instead of just cranking out as much plastic as we can. Somebody will find a use for it. Let's move upstream with some of these decisions.
Yeah, so and that sort of brings us around to another question, which is there such a thing as an environmentally friendly plastic? I mean, like,
I think that, yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, it depends on how you define environmentally friendly. So like I said, there might be some bioplastic plant-based ones coming online. But again, you still, even if it sounds great just on the surface like that, you need to look at what does that life cycle entail? How are they being made? How are they being, because even if it's plant-based, if they're breaking into fragments that stick around for a long time and people are inhaling them, and then maybe it acts like a particulate matter or a fiber in the lungs, that can be harmful. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work trying to do this, but again, we need to think about the life cycle and the hazard assessment for those as well.
Yeah, everything is a trade-off in many ways, and we just have to think about that. So we have a few questions around what people can do to reduce their exposure to micro or nanoplastics. Kind of some tips for everyday life that someone could use.
Okay, so there's I mentioned a lot on trying to reduce the production of these and how they're getting into the environment. But yeah, if we're talking about at the individual level, again, this is tricky, and some of these, aren't well, shall I say, validated yet. But based on what we know so far about micro nanoplastics and what we know about other things, I mentioned, so inhalation is becoming a greater concern with in comparison with ingestion, both important routes of exposure, but because they continue to measure in indoor air environments. Because if you think about the number of plastics we have in our homes, and then when you consider textiles and fibers that might have these components in them, that's where they tend to build up in the indoor environment in dust. Every time that dust is aerosolized, then we might be looking at a situation where they can be inhaled. So trying to reduce dust overall in homes, carpet and things like that, or a sink for dust, which includes what we call a sink. So they basically are harbored there. So a lot of chemicals we measure at very high concentrations in house dust, and microplastics would be contained in that. So if you think about activities, anytime you sort of disrupt that environment, you might be aerosolizing or making those things airborne. So trying to keep dust levels down, meaning frequent cleaning if you do have carpet, and using good filtration on vacuums, things like that, because vacuuming itself can really cause a lot of dust. Bringing in, again, less plastics into the home, thinking about more natural textiles can go a long way from the fibers perspective. What else? Cosmetics, I mentioned. Be aware of marketing with microplastics or they call them microbeads, things like that. Diet. This is a tough one because it's not like we can measure. We don't always know where our food and water are coming from. Unfortunately, they've measured it in all kinds of water, and it's still not clear if it's reliably higher in one type of water versus another. So that's going to go to bottled water companies, municipalities who treat water. How can they change their processes to reduce those levels? Foods, again, not clearly delineated which foods are the highest to lowest. Some seafoods have been much higher than, say, other land livestock based proteins. So again, there's a whole host of things that still we need more data to really narrow down, but those are some basic ones that we think about for a lot of different chemicals.
Yeah, so is there one item or sort of a class of items that release microplastics that maybe we aren't thinking about? Something sort of on the surprise.
Yeah, most likely. So I mentioned some of the big ones they've seen as they make their way into the waterways, and some that, like I said, when I started digging into this deeper, that surprised me because I hadn't thought about, automobiles as a primary source. But you think about how many tires um, are used every day and are worn down from that contact with roads. And then, I wear a lot of fleece in the winter, and now I'm like, so I try to go as many days as I can. Apologies to my coworkers between washes now that I have them, but there's things like that. Other sources, yeah, I think we're going to continue to learn again as we get a grasp on what these pathways and sources look like. I think we might trace back to other sources that we haven't really thought as much about, because the main things are direct or indirect. So direct are those microbeads that are manufactured that way, or the pellets that they use in plastic manufacturing and making plastics into other products. And the secondary are, you see a piece of plastic on the beach, it's exposed to a lot of UV, makes it more brittle. And then you have different agitators to that, waves or whatever it might be, that can really crush it into small pieces. That's an example of a more secondary way in which micro nanoplastics get out there. But yeah, so that's a great question and something I'm going to keep an eye out for as well.
Yeah, I'm curious if, for example, like drinking, getting your water from the tap versus having Culligan bring in big bottles of water. I've been wondering if those, even small plastic bottles of water or the large ones are, is just being stored in the plastic containers an issue, or is it more that the microplastics are already in the water?
I believe it's more that they're already there. So, Culligan's getting their water from someplace, right? But with the storage in plastic, you do have those concerns. If that plastic gets heated up a lot, then you might have some of those additives leaching into the water, but maybe not necessarily the particles, the micro nanoplastic particles. So again, a great question. And water is a tough one because, like I said, they've measured it in a lot of different types of water, but it's very high ranges are very high, and it's hard to predict, that particular bottle of water is going to have high or low levels versus that tap water from that, wherever you are. So that's a tough one, and there's no regulations related to water and nanoplastics yet. So nobody's really, systematically doing this at a high level, which I think might be needed moving forward.
Yeah. And what about like these kind of under the sink filters, or even a Brita or a whole house filtration system? Is that, would they be capturing microplastics or not? Like, do you think that would be effective? Ooh, I think Dr. Meeker is frozen. Let's see if he comes back. Yep. Okay, well, we will talk to Dr. Meeker about that question, and be able, when we send out our summary from today's webinar and our next newsletter, get an answer to that question about kind of water filtration systems. But we are at time, and so I think we can wrap up now. I want to thank everybody for joining us again today, and we will be doing these mini webinars once a month, and so look for our next announcement. And I know we had a very specific question about planning a research study, and we can maybe if you email the MyCares website, we can put you in touch with Dr. Meeker to ask
Hey,
that.
Leigh, can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi went out. I'm on my phone now. So
Oh,
sorry
no.
about that.
That's okay. Well, since you've come back, we'll just, and we're right at 12:45, so we'll just squeeze this last question in. And that was about whether or not these like under the sink filtration systems or even whole house filtration systems or Brita water filtration, if those would be effective at screening out microplastics.
They certainly would to some extent. Again, a lot of this is going to be based on size and charge of the actual plastic particle. So I think I'm confident they would really help with the larger ones. Yeah, I think that would help. It's just when you get down into that nanometer range, that's where it's probably less predictable and probably less effective. But yeah, for the larger range, like with any other particulate, I think they would be quite effective if used properly.
Okay, that's excellent. So we do have a very specific question for you about someone who's planning an environmental toxicology epigenetics study, but I have encouraged them to email the MyCares email address, and then we'll put you in touch with them. And maybe if someone from the team will just pop the MyCares email address in the chat, that would be great. So again, Dr. Meeker, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and talking about this. And we will put together a nice visual summary of today's webinar and distribute that through our next newsletter. So thanks everybody, and we will see you next month.
Thank you all.